Yeah.
Anything else?
No, I think we've hit our natural stopping point.
I'm sure you guys will have a lot of fun editing.
Not at all. Just
Nah.
throw it up there. Most of the editing process is just editing out the dumb crap that I say. So
Well, Christian's not here, so.
All right.
Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond. This is episode 23 of the Web Platform Podcast. Your hosts today are myself, Eric Isaacson, Senior UX Engineer at 3 Pillar Global, and Danny Blue, Senior Front-End Developer at Deloitte Digital. And today we are joined with Rachel Nabors.
I'm Rachel Nabors. I used to be a cartoonist for like 7 years, and then I ended up in web development, and I've been in here for 7 years. And now I've sort of started merging everything I knew from back in comics with everything I know about web animation right now. And you get some pretty interesting things when you start combining user interactions and interface design with the sort of tools and techniques that you learn as a sequential artist. Yes, I'm here to talk to you guys about all things web animation related. I'm really digging the web animation API these days. It looks like it's going to blow up big in 2015. I'm really excited.
Yeah, so are we. I was looking at the tinmagpie.com.
Yep, that is my company.
That's pretty awesome stuff. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, at the beginning of the year, I said, I want to start my own company because I want to be a boss, and none of these other companies are doing anything I feel like doing. I just want to make really cool stuff and show people how things are done. And so I started Tin Magpie and moved to Portland, Oregon, where all the creative and cool animators and cartoonists live. I could leech off their inspiring work. And Tin Magpie, basically, right now, we build interactive little stories, and we also turn around and train people in the lessons we've learned from using these technologies to build these things.
So do you also teach like basics of animation, like easing and the rules of animation?
Yep, I have a workshop on that, and that particular workshop we make a point of teaching animation from the perspective of traditional techniques. For instance, like here's how the CSS works, and here's why it should work this way, as opposed to, this is how easing works. And moving along, it's like, let's talk about how easing was invented and what exactly it means from a physics perspective.
So many curves.
And so
Yes.
From talking about physics perspective, do you find that there's limitations with some of the types of animations that are available on the web? You might use some for other purposes, specific types of animation or anything like that?
Oh, absolutely. Well, you're talking about physics, but physics when it comes to animation is much more than just easing. But as far as easing is concerned, like, all right, say you have something dropping down from the top of a page. It's a drop down, right? Now you could use linear easing, which just uses a constant rate of change, or you could use ease out, which starts slow and then speeds up towards the end, or you could use ease in, which starts fast and slowly. But if you think about dropping a ball, the physics, gravity pulls on it, so it goes from slower to faster. So you would want to use ease in, which starts slow and ends fast. You'd have an abrupt ending at the end when the full drop down is in display. So that's an example of how one could apply the laws of nature and the world of animation to an interface.
And for developers out there who want to get started in this, have you found that you teach designers differently than you would teach developers to do this?
Yes and no. I find designers are more interested in the theory and probably find the code less applicable. That's not to talk about coding designers, which actually adore this sorts of training. And developers, they also actually adore all of the science and the cool stuff with the history of animation behind it. So I would say if I change anything about how I teach people, it's that designers get heaps loads of theory and examples and prototyping education, whereas developers and coding designers tend to get a lot more hands-on code knowledge.
All right.
Cool. why not use Flash? I know, kind of weird coming from us, but Flash is built for this kind of stuff. So why use other web technologies like HTML, CSS, and JavaScript for the animations?
Yeah, or even Unity, right? It's still out there.
Yeah,
Would you really build a web app in Unity?
You could.
I guess you could.
Yeah, it seems like it would be a whole nother layer of stuff you'd have to learn to make something. And that while abstraction is nice, it's only nice if it helps you achieve your end goal faster, not necessarily slowing you down by going in a roundabout way to get to an end goal you could have achieved with the tools that you already prefer, such as if you're like a Rails app house. So the reason for using CSS is because it dovetails nicely with a lot of existing frameworks. For instance, AngularJS, it's got CSS-based animations. And you know, there are even like tweening libraries you can get for that. It's really nice. CSS just works better with HTML, which people are already using to build the things of the web. Now, when it comes to building cool little interactive story things like I do, well, like for instance, Alice in Videoland was this cool little project I did for an issue of Adobe Inspire, and I used CSS and JavaScript and HTML to make it, not Flash, and I didn't even use Edge Animate for it's Adobe's user interface for building interactive things in CSS and HTML and JavaScript. But I would say that the code it outputs isn't like production ready. It's not bad for prototyping, but I didn't want to use it for this particular project because I knew it would haunt me for a very long time, and it has. But point is, I could have done that all in Flash, but the main issue with building something interactive with Flash is that it has an expiration date on it. Now, this isn't something we tend to think about a lot in development, but as an artist, everything you make has an expiration date on it. Like you go to these ancient Greek digs where they're bringing out, anthropologists are bringing out all kinds of shards of pottery. Finding a whole vase or something that hasn't been broken is very difficult. But eventually there's going to be an earthquake or something, and the museum it's in is going to crash and it's going to be ruined. Everything that humans make has an expiration date. Now, when we had the printing press, suddenly we could get that expiration date through the roof because a person could write one piece of art and have it printed in 100 different places, and maybe one copy of that would survive for 100 years. So its expiration date was made much longer. Now, we're in a digital era where we can put expiration dates on code. And the great thing about digital things is it's even easier to distribute a piece of art that's written in information to many different devices. So that expiration date, as long as we can access it with digital devices, is once again really put out there. But there's an extra factor on those expiration dates, and that says, do you need an emulator in the future to enjoy the artwork? I mean, think of all those DOS games we used to play when we were kids. I remember King's Quest. I loved King's Quest. I still consider it a work of art. You need an emulator to play it. Now, we know browsers are dropping support for Flash plugins. So think of all those Flash animations and Flash games that we had at the beginning of the interactive internet era. Even things like Homestuck, which is this really cool interactive story, a lot of which has been done in Flash. Those interactive portions will not survive unless, there's a massive effort to somehow compile them into a more future-forward format. All of that art suddenly has a very short expiration date. And why I really enthuse about HTML and CSS and JavaScript is that because after XHTML2, it became apparent that browsers weren't going to do anything that would break the web. Browsers are always going to support HTML and CSS and JavaScript. So if you build something with those, there's a good chance it's still going to work reasonably well in a decade. Unless something comes along and completely replaces those three things, which I don't think is going to happen in the very near future. And if it did, we'd have a lot of porting to do of the World Wide Web at large. So that would make efforts to reclaim and archive these works of art much easier. Thus, I think, from a creative standpoint, making what you're passionate about with these tools, with this format, is a way, way better strategy going forward. It's worth the extra effort to learn now. Wow, that was a lot.
That was great.
Yeah, I've used Edge Animate, and I found that what it did was it generated a lot of extra code. You had a jQuery dependency, and there was so you really couldn't use it for like a production app where you were working with a team,
No.
right? So I had trouble with it. I did like the ideas that they had in there, and I think it's a much better leap than Flash. And
It is. It's in the right direction, and it is great for prototyping, like for
yes,
making interactive
totally.
prototypes. It's way better than Fireworks' interactive PDFs, I suppose. I mean, at least, it behaves like a website.
Yeah. Going back to what you said about when you see, you don't find too many vases in museums that are not broken. I still love going to the Metropolitan Museum of Art and seeing these things, even though they're broken. You can't
Well, aren't they
do that with
magical
Flash,
from...
right?
Well, you can't even see them at all.
Right. It's either you have the plugin or you don't. There's no progressive enhancement of it. There's no there's no of like you could see some of this.
Unless somebody were to write something that in JavaScript that could read Flash. Who knows? Maybe somebody will do that.
Yeah. Yeah. Hopefully not.
It's interesting because I was just enjoying a Japanese tea ceremony with my husband, and there's a part of the formal ceremony where you get to inspect the teaware and remark upon it. And older or chipped teaware is considered special, and it's like you talk about how, oh wow, this is really cool piece, right? It's like cherishing the old over the modern. And I was thinking to myself the other day, it's like, if this is a piece of pottery from 200 years ago, the fact that it hasn't been shattered, because I just broke my teapot, the fact that it hasn't been shattered kind of makes it a tiny miracle.
Yeah. I mean, it's enriched with memories, right? Enriched with culture.
It beat the odds.
It is a very cool way to think about stuff. I think sometimes people have a hard time understanding some concepts in digital, like not just code, but in digital products and items in general, and having something physical to compare them to is very, very cool.
I think it's cool too. Humans are still very physical animals, even though we're increasingly living digital lives. It's a really fascinating point. This generation is seeing some things that no other generations will ever see. This is when mankind came in from the physical world, for real. Because future kids all over the world are increasingly not going to grow up in the real world that we experienced as kids. I still remember being a teenager when we got the internet at my rural house. And I have diary entries where I'm talking about, I feel so bad because today I spent 3 hours looking at a screen and talking with people on the internet. I'm so happy I have friends now who understand me, but I miss the going out into the forest and being alive and doing things. And there's going to be a generation that's not even going to feel that transition in their life.
My children, even, they go for their tablets, right? They just grab them and start playing. And I found that we used to write in school. We used to have, much more hand coordination. And now, like with the tapping and the movements, it's not as much exercise on the fingers. There's this disconnect with the motor skills. It takes a little longer for a lot of that generation to build them up. So it's interesting you say that. To me, having children and seeing this kind of happen before my eye.
Musical instruments, make them learn one.
It's not the same as growing up outside the internet, though. Seriously, looking at those diary entries from back in the day, even a few hours in your day has a huge impact on what the outside sensorial input and activities you're participating in. Waking up this morning, the first thing I reached for was my phone, and I was thinking, how crappy is this that I am hooked up to my little dopamine feeding tube right here? I mean, look at me. This is like a rat in a Skinner box. Let me see how many more followers I have on Twitter. It's like the gamification of your life.
Yeah.
No cynicism there.
No, it's a new reality. And let's face it, when we're in nursing homes, it's going to be very different from the people who are in nursing homes right now. We may be complaining about all kinds of stuff. And I wonder if we'll even be able to relate to the generations coming out then. I just hope it won't be too late for me to get telepathic implants. I want to be one of those cool grandmas who's like, yeah, I got the telepathic implant and I'm broadcasting my mind and people really like my cookie recipes.
Nice.
If people still make cookies.
They will still always make cookies. There are a few things that will never die.
I hope so. I hope that they don't give up cookies for Twitter.
Baked goods is one thing that I think we're gonna have. I hope anyway.
Well, this conversation totally took
This
a
is
it
really
took
ran
a
absurd.
Totally
went
took a
veering
turn.
off into futurism right here.
Let's eat some cookies on the Web Platform Podcast.
Oh, yeah.
Yum yum yum
I like
yum.
Yum, yum, yum,
the
yum, yum.
conversational podcast.
I wanted to get back to web animations, if you don't mind.
Yeah, yes, by all means, let's go back to talking about what I'm good at.
Clients want to see something really impressive, really like out there, and some fading in and out, and really good animations that are performant, they're fast, and they want to see it tomorrow. The reality is when you're building an application, you're not building some trinket, you're building an infrastructure underneath, and a lot of times you can't really focus on building out that UI until there's this bottom layer to support it. And sometimes you can work backwards, but not always. So I kind of try to balance that. What can we show in our demos for each sprint versus what do we need to make demos happen?
It sounds a bit to me like you might be understaffed. You're starting definitely from the back end. I mean, I can feel you building your pyramid from that base, and there's nothing inherently wrong with that. But when you're working on the back end and you are expected to show something to a client, you really got to have somebody who understands what you're going through, who's got you from the front end of things. You need like a designer who is also a prototyper. And those animations are important, but if you leave them till the very end, I can assure you they are going to be superfluous and not something that will improve your overall product. If you're doing anything just so the client can say, ooh, wow, that looks nice, you probably shouldn't be doing it. I mean, I'm just telling you this because I don't want you to burn your fingers off. Clients don't know what they want. I mean, they do know what they want, but sort of can imagine them as like a young woman who's never had to dress herself comes into a really fancy shop and she's like, I need a dinner outfit for a really fancy dinner. I want sparkles and princess things. And of course, the first thing that the person at the desk goes, what exact kind of dinner is this? And she goes, oh, it's for my grandmother's wake. And she goes, and she leads her over to something a little bit more toned down and appropriate. You see, that's kind of like the client. The client is still the boss, but it's up to you not so much as to make them happy with whatever they ask for, so much as to direct them in the right direction to meet their goals. Animation is just like any other kind of design. It's just like your information architecture. You don't tack it on to the front of your back end at the very end. It's something you consider right up there with the rest of the app's design. It is a very interesting time because with animation, like even back in the era of Flash, people weren't building industrial scale applications with Flash usually. For the most part, people left that to native software, or there were a couple of very clunky interfaces that they'd use on the web. And now we finally have the chance to put as much thought into like gigantic scaling websites as we do to building like native apps. I'm not sure that we've ever had to build animations in infrastructures of this scale before. Like, how would we even go about testing that in a framework? Because you'd want to. You want to make sure that when people use the dropdown that it animates from the top down, not from the side in.
Well, I thought that the Flash technology, the answer to that was Flex, right? That was built for the rich internet application. A lot of banks had used that. They migrated from Java into building that. So I'm not sure. I don't know if it worked because now we're struggling to actually redo those applications in HTML.
Well, if the banks ever did use Flex to build huge applications, I'm not sure I ever saw one of them. And if I did, it certainly wasn't animated. Maybe Flex just didn't have enough time to get experience like that. I'm sure there's a listener out there who's going to say, well, actually, by all means.
I worked at a bank.
By all means, I want to see. Send me screen caps. There are a lot of challenges with using animations and interfaces and with getting them into the appropriate prototyping phase. Like when a client wants to hold something in their hands and poke at it, as opposed to seeing like an animatic of how something should work. It really does mean that you have to start thinking about it earlier, and you probably need to team up with people designers who have some code skills earlier as well.
You're obviously a big fan of CSS animations, and when you're working on some of these projects, you have to put a foot down with clients as far as browser support goes for some of these things as well. There always tends to be and that was one of the things that some people still like Flash about. I haven't used Flash since college, but they're like, you just write it once and then it works everywhere and you don't have to worry about anything. You're forgetting about plugins and all that kind of stuff. How do you tackle that where you're like, okay, well, we can do these really cool, rich animation things, but your support has got to stop at IE, whatever, 9, I guess.
Well, it's not like everything has to be animated to be useful. There are really good examples. Okay, so there are basically like 3 different kinds of animation on the web. There's static self-contained animation, a loading spinner, if you will. And then there's stateful animation, which is when you animate between two states. Go back to the drop-down, there's the closed state, and there's an open state. And it can jump between those, or you can animate between those, which is actually really good for usability if you do it right. And then, of course, there's truly dynamic animation, which defines its own end states. This would be like if you could imagine a first-person shooter. There's nobody defining every different angle of the kill you can make. That would require way too many lines of code. So there's a physics engine to figure out what that's going to look like and display it on the screen. Those first 2 are actually not too difficult to do as far as a backwards compatible way, because especially like with frameworks like Angular, if somebody doesn't have animations turned on, they just jump from one state to the next, drop down open, drop down close. They're not losing any functionality from that. For the rest of the world, they get a much nicer experience.
Graceful degradation.
Yes, thank you. It's like so many beats in that expression that I always tongue tie when I'm supposed to say it. Let's say you're building something that's more complex. It's like Alice in Videoland, and it's really cool, and animation is an integral part of the interaction. It's not just a usability factor. It's the whole reason you're on the page is because of animation. Then you have to talk to your client one-to-one about some very real numbers. Where are all of your visitors coming from? What are they using? For a more interactive piece like that, I think it goes without saying that you do have to negotiate with the client or with whoever you're working with internally. And there are, of course, some agencies out there like, we don't do that. We just, when the client says we want it to work with every browser ever, we make that happen. Even if it means spending like 80% of your time making sure that the code has a backwards compatible hack in jQuery to do the thing correctly. Point is, I have also spoken with agencies where they very simply say, well, you know what? We do get clients like that, and we're just very honest with them that if they want it to be supported in all the browsers, there are some things you're just going to have to let go of. There's some parts of the experiences that just won't be there. And we negotiate with them based on that. And I think that's a very honest and very realistic way to deal with clients. I would like to see more people doing that in the future. I feel like just saying whatever the client wants, the client gets is not realistic given the way web development actually works.
You have to set the expectations early, right?
Right.
And you have to set them correctly, because if you don't later on, it turns into a he said, she said type of game.
Right.
So I totally agree with you. We're pretty good about that here at 3Pillar, and I'm pretty sure Deloitte is, because Danny's awesome.
I tend to take the feature negotiation route myself. It's like, well, it's going to work perfectly in these browsers, which are the bulk of your traffic, and for this little 20% segment down here, they're going to get this experience, and it will be adequate.
Yeah.
Unless you want to spend double the amount of money to make sure that all 100 people
I found talking with clients, if you talk metrics to them and you say, well, if you want support for these other browsers, this is going to be the cost. This is going to be the cost in labor. And it could reach up to this much, depending, because we can't. There's always discovery phase with these bugs. They come up, and maybe Stack Overflow has something, maybe somebody knows something about it, and maybe not. Some of them are done quicker and some of them are done slower, but there is definitely a curve. Right. For instance, if you support IE9 or IE8, typically that'll add, up to 30% more overhead.
And if, you have to ask yourself, is that percentage of your traffic worth that amount of time? And for some companies, they're not.
Yeah. I mean, if you're losing 2% of your clients, right, and you have, 10,000 clients, that might not be as bad as you have 300 clients and you're losing the same percentage. Something to that degree. So understanding your traffic and having analytics to back that up for sure.
Yeah, I think it's important for both sides to be realistic. There will be the occasional clients who are like, money is no object, make it work everywhere. In which case, well, that's all the license you need. And you might have clients where it's like, oh, well, I only have 300 visitors and 20% of them are on these browsers that I have to support. Maybe they need to be a little less ambitious with what they're doing, because if those 300 visitors aren't worth that amount of dev time, then you might need to scale back expectations.
One thing I've found too is that usually accessibility takes a back seat. So a lot of
Yeah.
people will say, well, I can't make this accessible because it's too much cost to do this, and we don't have enough people who come on here. But then, then you find out that people have tried to access your site and they can't do it. And maybe it's one or two people, but is that something you struggled with?
And when we are talking about accessibility, we are talking about like keyboard controls, so supporting other input devices other than just mouse clicks.
Yeah.
Right. Actually, that's something we need to be considering more and more as people access the web. Even people we would typically consider accessibility concerns start accessing the internet in different ways. I know people who use their phone to read websites to them while they're driving. And, people are just using devices in ways we wouldn't expect. So accessibility might open up your website to different uses that you hadn't considered before, such as people who are driving. I don't think I'd want someone to be in a wreck because of my website, but consider it. Now, I want to make sure that I contrast what I just said about, well, how many of your users are coming? Maybe they're not just, maybe 30 people aren't worth paying for 30% more dev time. When it comes to accessibility versus browser numbers, remember that the number of people who have accessibility issues in the world is sort of a constant, whereas the number of people on older browsers is constantly falling. Nobody goes back to using IE6. So moving forward, we can expect there to be a constant number of people who have accessibility needs, and it, for that reason, should probably take a front seat to worrying about older browsers if you consider just, building code that's future-facing.
Yeah, we had Steve Faulkner and Marcy Sutton come on and talk about accessibility on the web in general, and it seems like if you know the do's and don'ts for ARIA and the basics of using alt tags and simple stuff that you can build it into your Jira tickets or your GitHub issues with very minimal overhead. If you do it consistently, if you try and backfill it, then you're going to have problems. It comes into play with ARIA will help with dynamic things, but like with animations and working with Canvas and SVG and CSS, have you had issues with accessibility with that?
First off, I will point out two major accessibility issues with animating things on web pages. And the first one is going to be with Canvas. This is one of the reasons why I did not immediately embrace Canvas as the answer to all of my woes, because Canvas is essentially an image element where you get to push the pixels around. All of the content, all the stuff happening in there, it's not legible for a screen reader. It exists in its own world. It's completely rasterized information that's only visually perceivable. And maybe that makes sense if you're building a shooter, but if you're building like an interactive storybook, for instance, that you may one day want to build something that reads to children from, Canvas wouldn't be the way to go. Which is one of the reasons why when I'm building cool little interactive things, I always start with the DOM first, because the DOM really does provide a great thing for other tools like screen readers to latch on to and help people through, which can make it fun. All right, so Amazon came out with this test thing called, I think it's the Echo, and essentially it's like having this little radio that always listens to you and talks to you and does stuff for you. You talk to it. I can't wait to try one out, but people are like, what if it overhears your intimate conversations and reports to the FBI? I mean, it could do that too. But the idea is that this is an example of something that could come forward. Now, imagine you've spent all this time building this really interactive storybook in Canvas, and then this audio thing becomes super popular. And you've been making this cool thing, and you've been selling it, and it has you suddenly have to make other things for this new device. Or if you've just been working with a more DOM-oriented approach in the first place, there might be very little you have to do to make it still useful with this new device that's caught on popular. So anyway, that's one of my justifications for working the way I do. The other big issue when it comes to accessibility with animation is that some people are simply not able to cope with animation. It makes them dizzy, it makes them sick. Um, we tend to think of these people as being older, but that's not always the case. There's a thing called a vestibular disorder. It's actually a set of disorders, but people who have them are often made very dizzy by motion. Even small motions, like a very quickly animated UI, can set them off. Now, most animations you use on a website, especially around your UI, should be discrete. They should happen so fast that people don't notice they're happening. If you're ever testing your animations and somebody says, "Oh, that looks very nice," you need to speed it up, because if it's long enough for them to notice, it's long enough for them to get annoyed by. Kind of like the start screen for a video game. You start punching skip as soon as you can after those first 3 times. So having making them fast, putting them only where they're necessary is one step, but what you really, really, really need is a kill switch. You need a way for people who are like, "Oh, it's so gross," to immediately just like turn that stuff off, which essentially builds into that let's build stuff that works on sites that don't have animation line of thinking. Not sites. Let's build stuff that works with older browsers that don't support animation line of thinking. Well, technically, you're going to need to consider that anyway if you want to be able to turn off animations for people who want to throw up every time they see them. So having a kill switch, a very like in the footer or in a bar across the top with the cookie information that the UK demands you display on every site. Like, do you want the animations too? Yes, no. That's not a bad way to start doing that. I've only seen a couple of sites trying to do something like this. I think we're going to see a lot more clever solutions to this issue in the future, and I've got my fingers crossed for 2015.
Yeah, I really like the idea of opting in rather than out too. Like, for instance, a simple case of that is a YouTube video, right?
Yeah.
If it auto plays, that's obnoxious to me. But for some users, it might be useful. But I like the opt-in where you can say play, or enable an animation rather than.
Do you want to hear audio, or is your boss in the next
Yeah.
cubicle and is going to get angry with you?
Exactly.
Yeah, I think that is important, and I've not always done this sort of thing on my own projects. You have to understand that my own projects are funsies for me, the ones I tend to display more about experimentation than best practices. But I think in the future I'll be using more and more of these just so that people have good examples to follow.
It seems you're a very big. It seems you're a very big proponent of usability in your animations and getting it to work for everyone. And so when you think of user experience in your animations, like what are the things you think about when a client comes to you and says, "Hey, I want this animation." Like, what are the considerations that you take when dealing with usability?
I don't know that I've ever had a client that came to me and said, "Hey, I want this animation." Usually I get approached about a project
Mm-hmm.
or I'm training people. Like, nobody comes to me and says, "We need you to animate our interface."
Well, what about when you pitch some visualization to them and they give you feedback? What are the things that you're considering when they tell you, "Hey, I don't like this," or "Why don't you use this technology because I know more than you about this technology?" You
I'll be
know?
honest, I don't have relationships with any clients like that.
Well, I think more of it is like, so the design process when you're coming, so like you talked about stateful animations for what the, so on your mobile device, like, so this is gonna have a hamburger menu or whatever. So when you're going through the design process of this should ease out, this should ease in, how do you go through that? How do you go through that usability process to come up with the things that you want to do?
Well, part of it comes to testing. It's always good to test with people, and that's why Edge Animate might not be such a bad thing to have in your tool belt. Even though it's not production ready code, you can at least put it on a tablet and hand it over to grandma and, observe her from a distance with some binoculars and a blind. So you can't beat people. That said, there are a lot of rules of thumb. Specifically, I know a lot of rules of thumb from the animation that sometimes even gaming fields, but you should always test them. You should always test them on actual people because sometimes they're called rules of thumb for a reason. They're not always correct. It doesn't always play out the way you thought it would.
Do you find in the early stages that you might do something like hallway testing and do, maybe paper type of animation? And not obviously it's not going to be the same, but to simulate the animations, or do you find that just not useful?
Some people do that, and I think if you work with a large team, that's really useful. I do not work with a large team. We're distributed. I tend to draw storyboards and share those out
Right.
and discuss them with people that way. So I'm more of a storyboard and prototyper. I've had collaborators I've worked with who send me tiny little motion videos of how something should look and feel. And that's useful to go on because then I can really see what she's got in her mind's eye and I can run it past other people. There's a bunch of different ways that you can actually try to get moving things in other people's headspaces. But when it comes to actually testing on users, you can't go wrong with something that's they can actually hold in their hands.
Cool. So can we talk? I know we've jumped all over the place a little bit, but at the very beginning you mentioned the new animation API that
Yes.
is coming along. Do you
Yes,
want?
yes.
So can you tell? So I'm vaguely familiar with it. And I know what it's for. Can you explain it to us in a little bit more detail and kind of from the ground up so that somebody like me can understand?
Sure. So the web animation API it's how do I put this? It is an API that gives you access to the same rendering engine that renders CSS and transitions and animations in Smile. And it's extremely useful because it harmonizes the CSS animation spec, its transitions API, sorry, not the specs. It's useful because it brings together the animations API, the transitions API, and it's all under one roof, as it were. So they become a lot easier to manipulate from a developer standpoint. Additionally, because now you have access to the rendering engine, you can access and fine tune individual properties, and it gives us a lot of access to things that Flash used to provide us with, such as differing timelines for different animations. So now not everything isn't tied to the single timeline of the browser. This is a problem you'll notice if you're using delays on animations. Say you're using a delay of 10 seconds on a spinner that's on a loading page, right? Well, if the website takes 8 seconds to load, that spinner will show 2 seconds after the page is rendered because the timer has already been going and that 10-second delay is already 8 seconds in. There's no way without writing a lot of JavaScript to get around that. But this way would allow us to build in timelines, build in different time objects for those CSSs. That would allow us to build in time objects that we could then use to pass around time values. For instance, there was an example I did for 24ways. Not 24 ways. I didn't have my tea this morning, guys. It's so technical and it's exciting. My head gallops ahead of my tongue. So back for my article for Smashing Mag about the state of the animation. I did this really cool example, which is based on some examples on the Web Animation API's polyfill page, where I had people create a bunch of different running cats. And if you make running cats with CSS, because the animations all start at different times, the cats are all running out of sync. But if you make it using the Web Animation API to copy and paste the timelines values to each different animation as you're creating it, you can get them all to run in sync because their animations all are starting at the same point in time. So it's exciting because timing has been a super big issue for creating more elaborate animations. But there are other cool things that it does. For me, I am exceedingly excited about nesting and grouping animations together, which is fun. But more than that even, is that because it's going to open up the rendering engine, it's going to allow both browser and vendors and independent developers to create better tools for handling animations inside the browser. For instance, Chrome might be coming up with this. Chrome and Firefox are both working on some really nice tools for manipulating transitions and animations in their dev tools. And that's great because right now that's like the hardest thing ever to do. For somebody like me, refreshing the page constantly and then getting yourself to the point in the interaction where you can rerun that fade in to see if it's working right is a pain in the butt. Being able to just manipulate things directly there in time would be so much more useful. But also imagine like someone could build an extension for building a spriting keyframe timeline animation so that you could upload images and then put them into an order and scrub through that timeline to build a sprited element on the page. And that's also really exciting. Also not possible, no, not as possible without this API. So the API is exciting specifically because it will finally allow us to crack open and have control over this rendering engine. And lastly, because it does help with performance. Because now animations are tied more directly with the engine, we're going to see vast improvements in performance because now the browser will be better prepared to make decisions about where it's sending the work for these animations to be done, whether it's being done on the main thread or its own thread. Yes, you're going to get the option to put animations on their own thread and sending them to the GPU. So it's exciting. It's a bunch of much needed improvements to how animations work inside browsers. And I hope more browsers will jump on and give it a shot too.
Anything that makes the web less janky.
Yes.
So I have a couple questions about that actually. As far as the technical pieces of this, so you're accessing the GPU, you're saying, for some of this. How are we doing that? Are we doing that via WebGL or is it through something else?
No, that's entirely the browser's call. You can kind of think of it as how will change works, correct?
Yes. Can we explain it for those who don't know?
So will change is a CSS property that you can use to let the browser know, hey, this thing over here, I'm going to move it. So you better do any optimizations you need to do so that when I move it, it doesn't, interfere with the rest of the stuff too much. And if it's something that the browser can look at and go, oh, this should be on its own layer and sent off to the GPU, the browser will go ahead and do that. This means you don't have to use the translate Z hack, which basically does it's like putting a 3D transform on something and then not doing anything with it just so that you can make sure that it's sent over to the GPU. This is sort of like that, except not horrible.
Well put.
The web animation API will basically be doing the same thing. You'll be giving it all these values you want it to change, and it'll be like, this one can be optimized, sending it to the GPU. This one I'll have to handle on the main thread. And it'll be able to look at those things and decide whether or not the animation can get its own thread.
Do we feel that will change will be supported in the major browsers soon?
I think it will be.
We had Steve Newcomb from Famous on. And he talked about how he was doing this mixed mode.
I was just as surprised as you were.
Yeah, they were doing WebGL, mixing with the DOM. So the DOM would render things that it's good at, like links and text and things like that. And then they would use WebGL for the other pieces because it's been enabled in iOS and other devices now. That's moving forward. They're going to have a full release for that in spring.
Nice.
But currently what they're doing is they're using the CSS matrix and a physics engine in there, and they are getting better than normal HTML DOM manipulation. They're getting much faster, less janky results. Are you finding that for some cases, some complex animations, you're having to do some similar pattern?
I'm not, but I don't do animations that are that complex. I know houses that do those, and they do go through the WebGL in a similar method. They do a lot of DOM rendering inside the GPU, from what I understand. At the same time, while that is really, really cool, part of me wonders if that isn't a hack we're using today for something that's not going to be an issue tomorrow. Because let's put it this way, browser rendering engines have been built for a very stateful web. They were built for a place where the only movement that happened on a page that wasn't controlled by Flash was probably the user scrolling, or maybe somebody's funny little JavaScript-based snowing animation. People haven't expected a whole lot out of the painting part of the browser for a long time. Now all of a sudden we got stuff moving. Oh my God, people are trying to move stuff while they're scrolling. What the hey? And browsers are, of course, they're a little shocked by this. They haven't been built with that in mind. However, browser vendors are people, and they do see what people are doing with the web, and they can improve how the browsers render things accordingly. Like Google has Project Ganesh, which, oh my God, they were talking about it at Chrome Dev Summit, and we're looking at some pretty insane frames per second coming out of there. Whether the other browsers can follow in suit so quickly, I'm not so sure. But I do think that we're going to see, at least from Google and Firefox, we're going to see better and better frames per second out of these two vendors, and as they duke it out for supremacy. And the nice part about that is that we can go ahead and write things in the DOM with HTML and CSS and JavaScript without using people's frameworks and still see really good frames per second. I like that. I'm kind of framework adverse because frameworks are someone else's way of telling you how to do things. If you want to just build an app, you wake up one morning, you're like, I need to build a to-do app. I gotta build this app, this site immediately. Frameworks are the way to go. Go ahead, get WordPress. Get WordPress, use Rails, use Angular, whatever it takes. Go ahead. But if you want to build something that's in your head, you want to realize it, latching on to something like Unity. Like Unity is great if you want to build the kinds of games that Unity was built for. But if you want to build a different kind of game that's in your head and all you know is Unity, you'll only know how to build a bunch of workarounds to make Unity behave the way you want it to work. Whereas if you had a more basic grasp of how the browser renders things and how to use JavaScript, etc., you might be able to build your own engine. I know that is just my approach for problem solving, and frameworks were great for everyone else, but I'm so happy to see that browsers are prioritizing optimizing animations inside the browser and getting those paint times down, because it makes it easier for people to strike it out on their own instead of constantly tying themselves to someone's not always open source project.
Do you feel like, though, that even though you're not using someone else's framework, that you're really making your own framework?
I don't have my own framework. I have a set of tools that I bring into play, and I pick my tools depending on what kind of thing I'm trying to make happen.
Right, and that's sort of the basis for a framework, right? So, I don't know.
No, I assure you, there's a big difference between a couple of Sass mixins and some functions you use and a framework.
And that's all the tooling you use for your code piece?
Yeah.
Wow.
Pretty cool.
You can do a lot of stuff with very little code. If you start framework first, you're always going to have a big code overhead. If you learn the basics and then you go, well, you know what, this framework is going to save me a lot of time, then you can move to frameworks.
A lot of companies are, so back to frameworks. So there are things like Famous and there are things like React that are saying the DOM is too slow currently. We're going to manage the DOM tree in JavaScript and handle the diff and things like that there. So your preferred approach would be, and one of the things they're getting out of this is performance. But you're saying that you would rather work with native pieces that the browser is giving you rather than somebody else's abstraction.
Me personally, I don't think there's anything wrong with going with somebody else's formula. But I personally think that there's nothing wrong with working directly with the browser too, especially if you're not in a place that demands the utmost of performance. I'd like to think that browser vendors very much do benefit from people still challenging them and building things. What is it? The world is full of crazy fools who don't believe what sensible people say. And because these daft and dewy-eyed dopes keep building up impossible hopes, impossible things are happening every day. That's kind of how browser development works. I mean, there's always going to be a framework or a Flash or something that lets you do things in the browser that the browser can't do, and the browsers catch up. The hard part is for the people who decide to slug it out with the browser because they suffer from the jank while the other people use the other frameworks. So it's, really, you should just go with what your gut tells you.
I can see that. I go back and forth with different projects depending on what the needs are, like using a framework or, rolling our own stuff, or if it's something very simple you don't need something.
Absolutely. And many different interaction houses build their own frameworks in-house as well, because other people's frameworks are built around their processes or they're built around everyone's processes. They might not be optimized for your workflow.
And sometimes those in-house frameworks end up getting open sourced as well for other people to use. Like I know sometimes, but so like there's a Pixie JS for a lot of companies will use them when they're making games for the web that are not Flash games. And then I can't remember the name of the company built an abstraction on top of that called Phaser.io, which I've used before to rebuild Flash games that I made in college, just kind of as practice. But that
Using HTML and
yeah.
Pretty cool.
Theirs ends up using Canvas, and it uses WebGL, falls back to Canvas, and then falls back to DOM. Sometimes, like you were saying, sometimes when people deciding to build their own framework ends up coming out as its own product on its own.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I love seeing when people do open source these things, but it's surprising how many places never release their code into the wild. Not necessarily because they're trying to hang on to trade secrets or anything like that, but more because they just don't have the time because of those clients that want everything done tomorrow. It's when are you going to support this open source project? It's like having a baby. It's really a high responsibility type thing.
If you put it out there for people to use, you better be prepared to back it up.
Yeah, to like handle all of their bug requests. I mean, all of their bug reports and pull requests.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if you start to get popular with all the stars and the forks and things, then wow, now it's a full-time job in addition to your job. So I think that's fear for some
And it's open
people as
source,
well.
it's not necessarily financially supported. That's,
Not so much.
I mean, games, that is, I think, my biggest complaint about the field of animation. While it's very exciting and it's incredibly useful, it's not necessarily the most profitable place to be. It is often, as we talked about earlier, only considered at the very end of processes, or it's used to build things like games, which are considered fairly inane. It's not like building, all right, say I'm a DBA and I build this really cool database structure and I put it up on GitHub and everyone starts using it. And suddenly I got people coming to me and being like, we need you to overhaul our databases and we're going to pay you a lot of money. I go, yes, this totally pays for my support of this thing. That doesn't really happen that way with animations or game frameworks. Nobody's going to come to you and say, we want to hire you as an animation consultant. You might get hired to do some trainings, but nobody's going to bring you in and say, animate all my stuff. And you might get a couple of people, if you release a game engine or something like that, you might get a couple of people coming in and being like, hey, we'd like you to build a game for us. But typically, people don't spend a lot of money on you to build a game. These are fairly narrow margin type things. People working at interaction agencies are often harried, overworked, and have little time left to spend, which to me says they're not getting paid enough. So that is one of the reasons why there are some really cool things in-house that we're just never going to see.
Now I'm sad. Now I want to see all the things.
I know, me too.
Um,
But we shouldn't leave it on that note.
no, not at all.
Quickly, let's talk about something happy.
Yeah, I was about to say. So, what? How do we want to end this? This has been a roller coaster of a podcast. I liked it a lot.
I'm not sure if a roller coaster podcast is a good thing or a bad thing. Is that like a sign of a good podcast, or is that a sign that things have gone out of control?
I don't know. Do you feel like you're going to throw up?
No, I'm feeling good.
Well, then I think it was good.
All right, so like we had a couple other things on here, so we can either talk.
Ah.
Yeah, so we can either, because I know we're bumping up against our time with you now, but so I'll kind of give you the pick. So we can either talk about like dev tools. So like we talked about them a little bit before when you were talking about some of the things that may be coming,
Yes.
Animations in terms of like data visualization pieces, and then one about kind of helping younger people learn how to express themselves digitally.
Let's talk more about tools and young authors, because
Okay.
that monetizing visualizations is something I still haven't figured out. Somebody from OpenViz, the conference, is probably a better person to talk to about that sort of thing.
So when you're trying to build your animations, you've decided what you think you want them to do, and you need to make sure that they're actually performing correctly and working correctly. What tools do you use to help debug and build?
Oh, we don't really have any of those right now. It was interesting because I was at Chrome Dev Summit, and there was this little kind of at one point, Paul Irish and Paul Backhaus gathered a bunch of people into a little circle to talk about dev tools. And everyone, was like, tell us about your processes. And everyone was like, oh, I use this. And it's like, and yes, we love the refreshing, being able to auto refresh. That's so useful to us. And I was like, I disagree. I actually don't want my page to refresh, because when I'm working with a transition or something like that, I might be really, really deep into the middle of something. Like maybe I'm at a fail state in a game, and I don't want to have to like work my way back to that point in the game. So either I end up setting up this really weird hashing system with the URL to make sure I can just jump to that state, or I end up messing up my code to put it the first thing I see on the page. Point is, it's kind of a fake state because you've tinkered with the way the process used to get there. And whenever you're using CSS to do anything, or even JavaScript, that can actually that can lead to some things that you weren't expecting. So I want to stay at that state and tinker with the like fade in and fade out values. For instance, I don't want the page to refresh. I don't want to go back to square one. I want to stay right here and work on this for a little bit because it didn't look quite right, and I want to try this different cubic Bezier with it. So I was probably like the only person in that circle who kept interrupting and saying, actually, the exact opposite for me. I don't know if any of those things will be put front and center, but I certainly have my hopes that Chrome and Firefox both seem really interested in improving the animation experience for authors, like being able to get to the keyframes associated with an animation when you're inspecting it in the in the DOM inspection tools would be so handy in Chrome. I believe Firefox has this already or is coming very soon. Being able to scrub through an animation would be great. What I would really love would be a way for people to record an interaction. Hit record just like when you're using the profiling timeline tool. Hit record, do something, hit stop, and then scrub back and actually be able to change the page, like go backwards in time, see where pain points are happening, and maybe change the start and end values and see what animating between them would look like for that one interaction. That would be so insanely useful. It's not something we tend to think about when we're talking about dev tools, though, because dev tools, let's face it, were developed by developers for developers. They, for instance, if designers had been working on dev tools, they would have put color pickers in first thing. First things first, color pickers. So you can tell that designers were not really involved in this process. Firefox, I believe, does have a color picker now, but that's now. It didn't have one at the beginning. So the point is, it's nice that we're getting some of these more designerly features at the end, but these tools are definitely not made with designers or visual people, period, in mind. I get the impression that the sentiment is, well, why don't you just console log that stuff? It's like, because I just want it to be on that side of the page. I can see where it needs to go. Could I just drag it there? And this is something that I think prevents more young people from getting into web development. A lot of young people started in web development, like myself included, some WYSIWYG, like Dreamweaver, or in my case, Netscape Composer. And it was only after we wanted to do things that those frameworks weren't capable of doing that we broke outside of those boxes and started inspecting the code itself. And then we started doing things for which there were no visualization tools, and we ended up flying blind. Ended up putting bits of code into our code to tell us what the code was doing when, because there was no way for us directly to look at the code, kind of like handling radioactive isotopes. We can tell what the radiation levels are even though we cannot see them, so we know to handle them with gloves. Still, for a young person running around in the room, they should not be handling radioactive isotopes. So,
Without gloves.
without gloves. So, we're having more and more people. It's interesting because there's like this entire subset of young people who want to tell stories online in new and unusual ways. Have you heard of Homestuck?
I have not.
No?
All right, I always talk about Homestuck when I talk about young people and the next generation of web designers and developers because Homestuck is the biggest thing that adults haven't heard of. Homestuck is, well, from MS Paint Adventures, if that gives you an idea. It's this interactive graphic novel that was originally made in Flash. Parts of it were made in Canvas, but it lets you move through and kind of interact with people. And it was so big that a few years back it had a Kickstarter for $2.5 million. And I wonder how much of that Kickstarter came from kids using their parents' Amazon's information. But the point is that when you go to comic conventions and you see people like they've got gray paint and horns, they're cosplaying as Homestuck characters. And I get emails very frequently from young people who are like, I think your stuff is really cool. How can I learn this? And it's so depressing to have to tell them, well, you'll need about 7 years worth of front-end development experience, and then you can start thinking about building your own framework. I mean, that's like the worst thing to tell someone who wants to get started today. That reminds me of when I wanted to learn how to program, and the only thing I could find at the library was a book on making circuits. I mean, it's like, well, you're starting at the very bottom. No gratification for you. So I feel like a lot of these people gravitated to Flash because it's such a great visual UI. And interestingly enough, one of my collaborators, she's from Russia, Zamag. She does the Black Brick Road of Oz, which is my first attempt at bringing this wonderful, formerly Flash interactive graphic novel to market as a web app, strictly as a web app, not building it in anything other than HTML and CSS and JavaScript. It's been a great learning experience. It's been a lot of fun working with her, but it's also been sad that she's built all this content using Flash first. And wouldn't it be great if she were able to have done all of that in a browser, just like manipulating stuff with this wonderful in-place IDE in the place where it's supposed to be consumed, and then she could just send me those files and I could package them up and sell them. I mean, that would be a much better workflow instead of her building everything in Flash first and then me having to rebuild it. I wonder how many other people have stories they want to tell, where they're either, putting an expiration date on their story, they're just not telling it at all, or they're having to do a lot of duplicate coding. So I'm hoping in the future that, especially given that the web animation API will let vendors do this, that we're going to see a more visually oriented set of tools come into the developer tools. I don't care if they call them designer tools, but just allowing people to grab things and move them around on the page, jump in and out of time space. That would be so useful. And I assure you, there is like this levee holding back so many people who would be coming into our field and injecting it with these fresh ideas in 10 years if they were just able to do these things now.
Well, it's true. When I learned animation, I was working with Flash 2 at the time. So it's like, not to date myself, but it was like really crazy that I had this interface with keyframes. I could tween just by a few different clicks here and there, and it was like magic. And you could see it. You can scrub back and forth, and it reminds me too. Like I not recently, I guess like 2 years ago, I saw Worry Dream. Do you know?
Yes.
Brett Victor. I saw his talk, the famous one about innovating.
Yes.
I forgot what it was called, but he had
the
like
one with the tree that blossoms and you can move between.
He had this iPad and he's going through the animation, just touching the screen, and it was like so simple, and it created this visual story that was just so quick and easy and just natural to do. And I think we are missing that as far as not just debugging tools, but creation tools. And I haven't found one that works well that way. I'm very excited if Chrome and Firefox are taking the dev tools to a more visual level, though.
I have my hopes. I don't know anything for certain at this time, but I think that I think there are great possibilities here. And it wouldn't just help young people, it would help like those of us in the field being
Yeah.
able to work on animations directly in the browser and having a little bit more fine-tuned control over them. My God, it would be so incredible and speed up workflows so much.
Yeah, animations are always rough for me.
They are rough because you have to refresh and then get yourself back to where they were. It's like I just want to replay this one animation over and over and over again.
Yeah. And the separate timelines is exciting. The fact that you can use Bezier curves on all of these is pretty amazing.
It is, and the Firefox DevTools, I believe, have a Bezier curve editor based on the one at cubic-bezier.com that Leveru made.
Oh, nice.
Yes.
And that's pretty awesome, being able to manipulate that curve directly in the DevTools. So, I mean, there are inklings of more useful DevTools coming down the line. So, like I said, I think 2015 is going to be a really exciting year.
I'm
Very
excited.
nice.
It's been awesome. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much.
Is there anything before we go? Is there anything you want to recommend for people to get started? And what's your Twitter handle or ways to communicate with you if people want to learn more?
I'm Rachel Nabors on Twitter. You can find me at rachelnabors.com. And if you want to get started on learning animation and such like that in the computer, you should stop by my site where all of my articles and my slides and even recorded talks are up for you to watch and read for free.
rachelnabors.com.
Good.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rachel.
Thanks, guys. Take care.
You too.
You too. This episode comes to you, at least in part, through the support and sound equipment generously supplied by 3 Pillar Global. 3 Pillar is a software product development company in Fairfax, Virginia, and 3 Pillar is a leader in creating purposeful and innovative product experiences. 3 Pillar was recently named to the Washington Post Top Workplaces list for 2014. So if you want to follow 3 Pillar on the Twitters, it's at 3 Pillar Global. And to find out more and see current job openings, please visit 3pillarglobal.com. That's 3, the number, pillarglobal.com. Thank you.